For the Triple Entente, the years which followed the conclusion of the Great War saw veterans return home triumphantly, yet worn. So severe was the action seen by some men that many nations felt it appropriate to put forward additional compensation for these returning soldiers. This could mean monetary credit, employment, but in the case of Australia, it meant land. Farmland in the western part of the country, an opportunity to establish a home for themselves and earn a wage in the production and sale of crops or animal goods. It was additionally considered a clever strategy by the state governments to settle and further populate fairly desolate regions to pave the way for additional development. As was in line with Australia's chief exports, wheat and wool were the cash products of these farms, and for a time many of these new farmers did well for themselves. However, even for those who'd achieved relative success, the coming Great Depression would soon bring a great weight down upon their ambitions. Initially, the government would reach out to these farmers and encourage them to up their wheat production through the promise of subsidization. Subsidies never came, however. The Australian economy continued to tumble, and farmers now considered withholding on the delivery of the wheat until they were properly paid. It was a series of events which intensified already present divides between East and West, which had historically manifested as desires for secession. See, the western lands of the country had always been less populated than the east, and as such the federal government often passed through policies which favored the more urbanized eastern states, even to the detriment of the agrarian west. Consider the relationship of the northern and southern United States leading up to the Civil War as a simplified analogy. In our world, a local state vote for Western independence turned out a 66% vote in favor of separation. However, the federal government refused to uphold it, as a joint constitutional convention only voted 42% in favor, while voting 58% against. Some worried that in light of this and the ever-worsening state Australia was finding itself in, that the West might attempt to secede violently, plunging the continent into war. This, of course, never happened, but it does paint a picture of the rising tension between the two Australian identities. As we mentioned, Western Australia traditionally hadn't been widely populated, and farmers had recently increased their crop output to levels higher than ever before. This introduces the subject of today's video, the emus. Native to Australia and inhabiting nearly the whole of the continental country, the emu is the last surviving member of its genus with a number of its own subspecies also native to Australia, half of which having been hunted to extinction within decades of European settlement. The emu stands roughly 6 feet tall, weighing at about 130 pounds, and as we'll soon find out, are capable of enduring so much gunfire that Major Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery compared their endurance to that of tanks. The emu possesses 3 toes on each foot, each ending in a sharp talon 6 inches in length. These talons are its main means of defending itself, inflicting strikes on potential threats with a powerful kick or swipe. The emus of Western Australia follow a migratory pattern based on the season, and in this instance were traveling from the western interior to the rich lands of the coast. However, rather than reaching their destination, the emus encountered farms with bountiful amounts of crop, as well as tanks and troughs of water meant for livestock. The farms had essentially provided a perfect feeding ground for the emus, encouraging them to remain in the area and inflict further damage upon the crops and farms themselves. The swarm of some 20,000 emus leaving barren virtually every farm they toured. The veteran farmers, intent on ending this menace once and for all using a means in which they were familiar, called upon the Minister of Defense to provide them the weapons and military personnel necessary to wage war on the emu. And the result is what came to be known as the Emu War. To quote an Australian bird scientist of the time, the war went a bit like this. The Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics, and its unwieldy army soon split into innumerable small units that made use of the military equipment uneconomic. A crestfallen field force therefore withdrew from the combat area after about a month. Or in plain English, the emus were able to both avoid and endure machine gun fire, sustaining only a few dozen casualties during the first campaign, the expense of fighting the emus ending up being far more costly than expected, with little to show for it. While the second campaign was claimed to be more successful, emu raids on farms persisted and the war ultimately ended in an Australian defeat. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline the Australians managed to overpower the emus? Since this scenario is a bit of a stretch, we'll just suggest that somehow the emus are driven from the land after having been absolutely devastated by the Australians, being brought down to about half their original population. Surprisingly, the Australian half of the story isn't too important. What is important is what became of the emus. Brutalized, routed, and humiliated, the emus find themselves forced deep inland into the arid deserts of Central Australia, not even granted passage to their seasonal migration spot along the coast. Many would be demoralized, shocked, and haunted by the events. Many more left angry and vengeful. Since the arrival of the humans, there had been a reckless and cold-hearted destruction of the emu habitat and population. On 3 islands, the humans had exterminated the emu population, and now they've tried their hand at the mainlanders. No longer would so proud a species, one whose roots trace back to the mighty dinosaurs and stood present as the world's second largest bird, allow itself to be intimidated by lowly mammals, let alone a species as physically weak as humans. Very long has the curiosity and playful nature of the emu been mistaken for weakness. That would finally come to an end. Investigating the humans through recon operations, the emus would uncover the great disunity within Australia, coming to realize how vulnerable Western Australia truly was, with its human settlements so few and isolated. A rallying call is made to the inland emus, a land force of some 100,000, directing them to charge through the Western Australian landscape like a Mongol horde, doing whatever possible to hurt the enemy. With several humans and farms captured, entire towns cut off from their food supply by vengeful birds, Western Australian leadership was forced to submit to emu domination. The second half of the 1930s would see geopolitics shift dramatically. Italy annexes Ethiopia, Japan and China would once again be at war, Germany would annex Austria, and the emus would conquer Australia. Humans would either be enslaved or shipped off to Tasmania, where they'd be forced to recover the skeletons of the extinct Tasmanian emu as reparations for the crimes of their ancestors. Japan would become quite impressed with how effectively the emu solved the Australian question, and extend an offer of alliance between their two empires, giving the emus access to Japanese naval assets to expand their reach, secretly believing they might use the emus to further their own conquest of the Pacific. This relationship with Japan would bring the emus to both Germany's and Italy's attention, the Germans expressing tremendous respect for the emu's volkish character and sense of ancestral pride, claiming the emus to be the master race of the flightless birds. The emu leader had been in discussion with the cassowary tribes of the northeast, a genetic cousin of the emu species, which is slightly smaller, heavier, stealthier, but also more aggressive and much more dangerous. An agreement had been made for the emus and cassowaries to secure New Guinea, an island the cassowaries considered rightfully theirs, and which if secured would strengthen the emu army with some of the best living avian warriors on the planet, making the next phase of the emu plan all the easier, a conquest of New Zealand and liberation of the Kiwis from human threat. The emu leader with access to human resources had learned extensively of his past, more than mere verbal traditions could pass down. The emus, cassowaries, and Kiwis were all of one master lineage, the Ratites, birds who managed to retain some of the size and strength of their dinosaurian ancestors, the largest being the titanic elephant bird, long extinct as a result of overhunting by humans, its closest living relative, perhaps ironically, being the relatively small kiwi. Angered by humanity's continued destruction of the Ratite population, seeking to recapture a lost greatness and preserve the majesty of surviving Ratites, the emu leader envisioned an empire which encompassed not merely Oceania, but included the occupied lands of the South American rhea and the African ostrich as well. As Germany launched its invasion of France, so did France's far-off colonies become fair game for the Axis powers, Japan seizing upon Indochina, whilst the emus claimed Madagascar, the former home of the extinct elephant bird, and thus a land of great sentimental and historic value to the empire. The emus would play a tide-turning role in the Pacific once the Japanese brought the US into the war, the emus launching an invasion of Chile, splitting American Pacific assets and allowing Japan to solidify its dominance over China, then using the manpower from its conquered lands to crush the smaller American offensive. Prior to this, the emus also took part in occupying South African forces both locally and in the East African campaigns, allowing Italy to gain a hold in North Africa and secure a supply of oil for Germany, while at the same time cutting Britain off from India. The war is finally drawn to a close as Britain is unable to carry on, causing the US to lose momentum in its war against Japan, whilst the Soviets are defeated by a better supplied Germany with its full efforts funneled eastward. The Emu Empire, now the Greater Empire of the Radites, would, as was secretly arranged with Germany, claim all ostrich-occupied lands from the Horn of Africa to the west coast. The Italians are of course shocked by this seeming betrayal, the Emu's support in East Africa having been a ploy all along to annex the region post-war. The Japanese, having initially seen the emus as lightweights who could easily be overpowered once they outlived their utility, would come to admire the great achievements of the great avian empire and respect them as a geopolitical equal. Germany, having respected the ambitions of the empire since the very beginning, would introduce emu leadership to a scientist by the name of Lutz Heck, a scientist who, at the time, had been experimenting with breeding back animals to an earlier form, of course producing new animals entirely, but ones which more closely resembled their ancestors, with much the same hardiness and strength they once possessed. The emus, intrigued by the prospect of breeding back to a grander form, may work with Heck to recreate the great elephant bird, and should this be successful, perhaps attempt to go even further back. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.